Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is brought to you by the StarQuest Production Network and is made possible by our many generous patrons. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you in part through the generous support of Aaron Ferguson Electric and Automation at aaronv.com, AARONV.com, making connections for life for your automation and smart home needs in North and Central Florida. You're listening to episode 177 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, where we look at mysteries from the twin perspectives of faith and reason. In this episode, we're talking about Dr. Edwin May and his career with the government's psychic spying program, Stargate. I'm Dom Bettinelli, and joining me today is Jimmy Akin. Hi, Jimmy.
Howdy, Dom.
Folks, be sure to stick around for the end of the episode, as we'll have your feedback on our recent episode on the Exodus. But first, in 1975, physicist Dr. Edwin May went to work for the Stanford Research Institute. He was assigned to a project involving the psychic power known as remote viewing. He was working with figures like Ingo Swann, Hal Puthoff, and Russell Targ. In time, Dr. May became the head of the program, which he oversaw until its closure in 1995. Since then, he's continued his work in parapsychology. So how did Dr. May become involved? What happened with Project Stargate? And what has Dr. May learned in his unique career? That's what we'll be talking about on this episode of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. So Jimmy, what do we need to say to begin today's episode?
Recently, I had the opportunity to sit down with Dr. May for a series of interviews. So in addition to the audio version of today's podcast, we'll also have a video version on my YouTube channel. And I recommend that listeners go there to check that out. And while you're there, please be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon for notifications. I'm trying to grow my YouTube channel, so I'd really appreciate it. I'm honored to be able to interview Dr. May because a while ago he retired from doing interviews and he doesn't do them these days. But a remote viewer in upstate New York named Jimmy James is a fan of Mysterious World and he knows Dr. May, so he took the initiative to put us in touch, and I owe this opportunity to him. One of the things I'm trying to do on Mysterious World is interviews with all of the people that I can who were connected with Stargate and develop a kind of oral history of the program and let everybody tell their story as they experienced it and share their perspective. I'm thus very pleased to be able to speak with Dr. May, as I am everybody else who took part in the program. And on a personal note, Dr. May has experience in the past as a square dance caller, and I'm always happy to talk with fellow dance callers.
Will we be doing the usual faith and reason perspectives today and what they have to say about psychic functioning, such as remote viewing?
Remote viewing is the reported psychic ability to pick up on information about a remote location without using familiar senses like sight and hearing. Basically, it's supposed to be a weak but natural human ability, something that's part of human nature. We've devoted several previous episodes to remote viewing and similar topics, so we won't be reviewing all of that material today. Listeners who may be less familiar with it should go back and listen to episodes like episode 79 on religion, magic, psychic phenomena, and science, episodes 102 and 103 on remote viewing, and episodes 105 and 106 on St. Thomas Aquinas and the occult. As we covered in those last two episodes, Christian thought, and Catholic thought in particular, has recognized a place for weak natural human abilities, like psychic powers are claimed to be. In fact, doctors of the Church, like St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas, believed in what we today would call psychic abilities. Whether such abilities actually exist is a matter for scientific studies to figure out. We won't be focusing on that today because our purpose is to explore Dr. May's career working for the government on this project, but you can check out both past and future episodes to get a sense of what current scientific evidence suggests.
Before we get to the interview with Dr. May, I do want to take a moment to thank our patrons who make this show possible, including Kevin E., Greg W., Arlia S., David R., and Tori. Their generous donations at sqpn.com/give make it possible for us to continue Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World and all the shows at StarQuest. You can join them by visiting sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you in part by Catechism Class, a dynamic weekly podcast journey through the Catechism of the Catholic Church by Greg and Jennifer Willits. It's the best book club, coffee talk, and faith study group all rolled into one. Find it in any podcast directory. And by Fearvento Law, PLLC, specializing in adult guardianships and conservatorships, probate, and estate planning matters, accepting clients throughout Michigan, taking into account your individual healthcare, financial, and religious needs. Visit fearventolaw.com, FIORVENTO law.com.
And with no further ado, here's my interview with Dr. Edwin May. Dr. Edwin C. May spent the first part of his research career as a physicist doing low-energy experimental nuclear physics. He became interested in doing research into parapsychological phenomena in 1976 when he joined the U.S. government-sponsored work at SRI International, including what eventually became known as the Defense Department's Stargate program. Under Stargate, he authored or co-authored 300 formerly classified reports to various U.S. government agencies within the military and intelligence communities. Dr. May has managed complex interdisciplinary research projects for the U.S. federal government. He presided over 70% of the $20 million funding and 85% of the data collection for the government's 22-year involvement in parapsychological research. Currently, Dr. May is Executive Director of the Laboratories for Fundamental Research, where he continues his parapsychological studies. Dr. May, welcome to Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World.
Well, thanks, Jimmy. It's a pleasure to be here. I need to correct one thing you just said, however.
What's that?
My first interest in parapsychology dumped on me in 1971, long before I had ever heard of the Stargate program.
Okay.
My boss at the time in the cyclotron laboratory, John Youngerman, had built a gadget, a pendulum. And the bob of the pendulum was a very shiny mirror, and he had laser interferometry to know exactly where the position was. And he wanted to know if people could use their mind to change the swinging pendulum. And what are you doing? You know, at that time, I'd never even heard of extrasensory perception. This is silly, but I'm a good guy in terms of building stuff. So we put a lot of effort. Long story short, this was such a sensitive thing that the only thing it was good for was an exquisite seismometer. We could measure trucks going along Interstate 80. So we gave up the project. But that was the beginning. And then the next stage of that, Professor Charles Tart, professor of psychology, had arranged for a seminar over the weekend. And I was, in my 30s at the time and bored out of my mind. So I saw this thing, come and learn about out-of-body experiences. What in the devil is that? No idea.
Right. And we should mention for the audience, Charles Tart is another famous parapsychological researcher.
Well, yeah, but he'd probably much more be like considered as one of the leading authors in terms of altered states of consciousness in normal psychology. So he's both. Anyway, there was a guy by the name of Bob Monroe, who has a facility now in Virginia called the Monroe Institute. But at that time, he was in his 50s and I'm in my 30s. And I'm thinking of this old guy. He's up there talking about the weirdest thing I've ever seen in my whole life. Here he heard about it, that he had gotten out of his body, whatever that meant, and he pinched his girlfriend on the butt and raised a welt. Oh, really? So I bought the book called Journeys Out of the Body, read it, said, oh, hey, if that guy can do it, I'm a physicist, I should be able to do that. So I tried a couple nights in a row, nothing happened. I said, this is silly, and put it away.
Okay.
Then I ran into somewhere about a year later, a guy by the name of Chuck Honorton, who was instrumental in the dream research at Maimonides Medical Center in terms of ESP dream research. And he had answers to all my questions. And long story short, he became a mentor of mine for a very long time. Spent a year in India trotting around trying to find miracles, found none. And when I came back, I worked at Maimonides Medical Center for 7 months. So that was my first immersion into research. I ran into Ingo Swann, and he got me my job at SRI and Stargate. That's how it all began.
So before we get too far down the road, why don't we talk about your own personal background?
Sure.
Where did you grow up? What kind of family life did you have? What was your education? That kind of stuff. What would you like us to know?
Okay, well, I'm an open book. I was born in 1940, before the U.S. entered World War II even. And it turns out my father was in the Navy, and after Pearl Harbor, we followed my family, my mother and my two sisters followed him around while he was being stationed around in the U.S. till he went overseas in the Pacific. For some reason, after the war, we ended up settling in Tucson, Arizona. What a Jewish family is moving to Tucson, Arizona in the middle of this seemed utterly ridiculous to us. But we bought a 40-acre ranch, and very odd for that period of time, two families lived together on that ranch, sort of communally. The DeRoy family and the May family, and they had two daughters, and we had two daughters, and so on. And it was fun because I grew up as a rancher. We had 40 acres of alfalfa and chickens and 8 horses and a mule. It was a lot of fun. I learned how to shoot, learned how to calf rope. I was a junior rodeo character. So that was a lot of fun. Probably the biggest impact it had on me, I became a very, very well marksman with a rifle, 22 caliber. And I was the youngest person in the National Rifle Association. In those days, that was a good organization to get what's called the Distinguished Marksman Award. I was like 9 years old. And that's still with me. I don't shoot much anymore. In fact, for a very long time, I haven't. But I was on various teams, rifle teams, and competed at the national level and so on.
And where did you go to school? How did you get into physics?
My parents shipped me off to a boarding school, preparatory school, they called it in those days, when in 7th grade through senior year. And in my sophomore year, I took biology. I wanted to become a biologist. In my junior year, I took chemistry. I wanted to be a chemist. Guess what I took in my senior year was physics. And I just was fascinated by it. And I went off to the University of Rochester. My mother was really upset with me because I didn't apply to MIT. I was born in Boston, and she grew up in Boston. We got to go to MIT. So, that's an engineering school. Yuck. I want to go to a physics school. So I went to the University of Rochester, which was a much better choice. And I started in the physics program, and it turned out on the first day of physics class, the professor came to me and said, "I'm sorry you can't be a member of this class because you didn't get into the calculus course. Your mathematics aren't strong enough, and I need to teach to use calculus." So he said, "I can't force you to leave." And I said, "Can I stay?" And I did, because he was so far out ahead of the calculus course, he had to teach it as he went along. So I did very well in that course after all.
And you ended up getting your doctorate.
Not there. That was only undergraduate, yeah. Then I went to graduate school at then was called Carnegie Tech, now called Carnegie Mellon. That's the good news. I flunked out of there. The only piece of reality I had in those days with regard to physics was I was walking down the corridor on the second day I was at the school, and I looked into this laboratory, and there was kind of a rotund chap from India. Sachinta Jha was his name. And he was huddled over a table with apparatus. I went in there and said, "Oh, that's a gamma-gamma angular correlation table." He said, "Huh? How do you know that?" I said, "Well, I did an experiment at Rochester doing the same thing." That started probably a 20-year relationship with this man. I worked in his lab, and that was the only physics reality I did. I did horribly in all my classes. I learned to play a bagpipe, and I play pinochle over lunch and so on. And when you flunk out of a graduate school, they usually give you a door prize called a master's degree. I was so terrible that they didn't even give me a master's degree. And the Army was knocking on my door early on in Vietnam to get, draft me. And Jha said, "Hey, I've got a contract for the Navy, tell you what, how about if I hire you? I'm going to pay you and hire you as a lab assistant, which he did, saved my butt. And one day I came to the office and he said, come with me. And he grabs me literally by the hand. And we walked down the street to the University of Pittsburgh, literally down the street, into a lab where there's a guy there named Bernie Cohen, who I had no idea who the hell he was. And Jean said, Bernie, you need to have this guy. He's the best experimentalist I've ever met. He's had troubles academically. And Bernie said, Jean, anybody you recommend, he's my student. And that's where I got my PhD eventually.
Okay. And you published a variety of papers before getting in the field in physics, before getting into parapsychology.
Yeah, in fact, there's an amusing story about that. I went to Bernie and I said, hey, look, I don't want to write my thesis that says, in the beginning, God invented a nucleus. Come on, that's ridiculous. How about, what can I do? He says, well, you've already published some work in the journal in Physical Review. You can take one of those papers and have it as the front end of your thesis. I said, okay. I have a very short thesis, it's 47 pages. And so I did that, and it was no problem. I get into the graduation where you have to defend your thesis in front of an army of critical scientists. And one guy, there was a fellow by the name of Norman Ostern, a very, very imposing character. He had no hair on his head anywhere. And he was sitting there flipping through a copy of the Physical Review. He says, Mr. May, I'm in a coat and tie and sweating like crazy because it's hot in the summer. And so I see a very clear correlation between the first part of your proposed thesis and the scholarly work published. And I said, no, it's an exact copy, sir. Wrong thing to say. Because what I failed to do in my thesis was to reference myself. And this was his way to just unnerve me, which it in fact did. But he let it survive. It was really troublesome. And they eventually gave, well, not quite. Interesting story here, Jimmy. In those days, you had to prove proficiency in 2 languages other than your native language. I commissioned them to do it, let me do Fortran, because I was pretty swift at Fortran, but they wouldn't do it. So I had taken German in high school and 2 years of German in college. The problem was the last time, my last class in college was, Ed, we'll give you a passing grade if you promise me you will never, ever try to speak German again. Oh, dear. So, but with the dictionary then, and even now, I can translate anything. But they switched over to Princeton Education standardized multiple choice questions. And I don't know if you know about German, it's a real big pain because they have 3 genders and slight different endings on all the adjectives. Yeah. Oh, man.
It's highly inflected, yeah.
It's just terrible. So I flunked it 7 times. Okay, so I said, well, I don't know a word of French. I got to try the French exam anyway. So I get the French and I'm sitting there and I can't read any of the questions. So I said, close the book. And then I randomly distributed my answer in the sheet. And of course, that didn't work. Second time, there was this very attractive woman. I sat next to her and said, she probably knows French. I'll copy everything she did. And that didn't work. So I never did pass my exams to become a candidate for the degree. But I'd already written my thesis, already had gotten a postdoc assignment at Davis. And I said, I'm out of here. I don't care. I'm leaving. So I drove across the country with a friend of mine and we camped out all the way. By the time I got to UC Davis, my mailbox there was stuffed with angry letters because in my absence, the University of Pittsburgh had abolished retroactively all requirements for the language degree, for the language issues of the degree. So they gave me my PhD after all.
Oh, okay. Well, that worked out.
Lucky me.
Now you mentioned Ingo Swann and how his involvement in you joining the Stanford Research Institute, that was in 1976. What happened on that occasion? How did that work?
It was actually late in 75. When I came back from India, I worked at Maimonides and I went to a party. A friend of mine took me to a party at Ingo's flat and I met Ingo. And we became really good friends, actually. Although one of the things, we were out for dinner one night in the village, and he said, Ed, you don't want to be my friend. How come, Ingo? He says, I can be a bitch on wheels, end quote. And that was an understatement, actually. And I put that in the obit I wrote for Ingo after he passed away. But we did some work at Maimonides with the random number generator that I built for Chuck Honorton.
This is in New York.
This is in New York, yeah. And in fact, the picture of it is on my wall behind me. I can show you. Got astounding results, actually, much to my surprise. And Ingo said, well, you know, I'm glad you're an experimentalist. The two guys I'm working with out in California, neither of them are physicists. Well, one's a physicist, but he's not an experimental physicist. I need you to come out there because if I'm going to do something magical with psychokinesis, I don't want to be claimed later that somebody flipped a light switch down the hall and it could count for my effort. I said, okay, but what's going on? He says, I can't tell you. So Ingo went out to California and just beat up mercilessly on poor Puthoff because Ingo was not your quiet, shy guy. And sure enough, Hal hired me as a consultant in late 75. And that consultant status went on until 1979, where they finally brought me on board as a senior research physicist. And Russ Targ left in 82 and Hal left in 85. And I took over the program as a director in 85.
And you then shepherded it for the next decade.
For the next decade, exactly.
One thing we might want to clarify for the audience is there's more than one type of physicist. Now, physicists study basic phenomena in nature, but some physicists are on the theoretical end, meaning they propose theories and do calculations and then propose perhaps experiments to test the theories, but
Yes.
they don't carry out the experiments themselves. There are
Usually not, yeah.
Yeah, there are other physicists known as experimental physicists who do that. And so that's what Ingo was saying is we don't have the kind of experimental guys who are used to running the physical tests at SRI that on this project that I would want. And so that's why he was interested in having you there.
To some degree, yes. Hal is not a physicist. He's an electrical engineer, a damn smart one, and knows an awful lot of physics.
And Russell Targ, though, is a physicist.
He's a physicist. He never finished his graduate school studies of it, but a very good guy. And he's both experimental and theoretical, both, Russ is.
Okay. Now, could you tell us about the work that you did at SRI? What kinds of tasks were you and your team doing? I understand that the program was intended to have both a research aspect and an operational aspect, but it didn't quite work out that way. What can you tell us here?
Well, early on, there was only 3 tasks, and all of them were to gather intelligence. The agencies funding us, CIA, and then eventually Foreign Technology Division of the Air Force, and then eventually Defense Intelligence Agency, they were absolutely not interested in research. They wanted to know.
And by that, we should clarify research into what is this phenomenon? How does it work?
Yes.
Things like that. They were interested in the practical application of it.
Yes, and the reason that was true, in 1969, a well-known information theorist in the Soviet Union, Ippolit Moseyevich Kogan is his name, wrote an article in 69 saying, is telepathy possible? And the intelligence community of that day said, well, we don't know whether it's possible or not, but it has obvious intelligence collection implication to it if it is true. So that's how they brought Ingo Swann initially out there to try to see whether any of this was true. And that was one of the 3 tasks in the early years that we were confronted with. One is to verify, is there a threat from anywhere, China, Cuba, or Russia, if this stuff is true? Not to validate it, they assumed it was true, that ESP is real. We were not, in those days, ever concerned at all about showing the existence of remote viewing or psychic stuff. Is it real or not? That was not the issue. They said, let's assume that it is. Second thing, if we could be actively spying using it, to use the vernacular, then so could they. Could we, then we called that section called foreign assessment. What threat does it propose? And can we develop countermeasures to ameliorate that threat? And thirdly, we could do some research, but it's not the fundamental research to figure out how it all works. The research we were asked to do was, what can we do to improve the quality of the output of the product? And that went on from 72 through, with some variation, up to about 1985, where I ended up getting a contract to, most of which was basic research at that time.
Now, so one thing I want to make sure the listeners understand is that this was a public side of the program. This was being run out of these government think tanks initially, or defense contractors, initially SRI, the Stanford Research Institute, later SAIC, the Science Applications International Corporation. And these are civilian organizations. They're not part of the Defense Department.
Correct.
So you were doing work on the civilian side of the program, but meanwhile there was also, or at some point, there developed a Defense Department program that was run out of Fort Meade, Maryland, and it went through a number of different names, Grill Flame, Center Lane, Sunstreak, and eventually Stargate, which is what it's known for having as its code name. What about the civilian side? What did they call it?
Well, there really wasn't that much of a split between the two. The civilian side, we all thought of it, and so does the government, as the contractor side. That this Department of Defense or any agency in the government says, well, we have this need. We can publish requirements. Please submit us proposals to help us solve this particular problem, whether it's transportation or who knows what all. In this case, it was the intelligence community, and we have this need. Turns out they did what is called sole source, where they don't put the request for proposal out to a large number of different people to compete, and they choose who would be the best contractor. They sole sourced it to us for a variety of reasons, and we've written extensively as to why that's the case. So it wasn't until late 78 to 1979, much over the objection of us, that the Army INSCOM, the Internal Security Command, wanted to have their own unit. And we said, no, it's too early to do that, because up until that time, we were providing the intelligence product. But they did it over our objections, and they screened, I don't know, maybe 300 or 400 people, and they ended up with 6 of them at Fort Meade initially. And they came out one at a time to SRI and a program we called technology transfer. And it was one of the amusing parts of it, because they're so secret, they didn't want anybody to know. Each person that came out for a 2-week visit, one at a time, signed themselves in at our front desk under the exact same name. Namely, their colonel, who was the boss, Scotty Watt. And so we're beginning to laugh because we have a classified building, and they're all coming in and revealing something bizarre is going on here, including one woman who signed in as Scotty Watt. Well, come on, guys, that's ridiculous. But of those 6 people, 4 produced significant results, one of whom was Joe McMonagle. And so that started it. Then Ingo started working on, but actually this is less personal, it's more about the research side of your questionnaire. Mm-hmm. Ingo Swann was probably a huge respect for the man, not only because he got me my job, but more importantly, he would spend up to 12 hours a day at the library at Stanford looking at, trying to understand what his internal experiences are. Now, he's not a scientist. He had an IQ off the charts, 160, something like that. Very smart guy, but he had no science background. He's an artist. And so he discovered something called operant conditioning. Now, in my past, I spent about 1.5 years as the chief physicist at the San Francisco Biofeedback Institute of San Francisco, which I learned a lot about how bodies work and the autonomic nervous system, blah, blah, blah. I built hardware for them. And I know a lot about operant conditioning. Unfortunately, Ingo did not. But nonetheless, he thought, aha, and he developed a training procedure. And this training procedure was he would give the geographical coordinates to some place and ask somebody to respond very quickly to it, because that was his operant conditioning idea. And he developed this training method, and it was, excuse me, a disaster. And the reason it was a disaster, and I blame all of us for this, we shouldn't have allowed him to do it. he would sit, let's say you're the remote viewer and I'm sitting here and I have an easel in front of me. You can't see what's on the easel. And I see a photograph on the easel. You do not. And you remember the old program called 20 Questions?
Yes.
Okay, so you would say, well, I'm getting a image of water. And I say, correct. Oh, well, it's maybe a waterfall. Can't feed back on that, and so on. Ingo was giving answers to these questions. You didn't need to be psychic to get a perfectly good score on that, because Ingo violated and we allowed him to do it. The fundamental rules of good studies, blinding conditions to blind the person. Not only should the interviewer be blind to what the target is, so should the analyst who's looking at the data. And all that was broken. Unfortunately, Ingo was allowed to train these original 6 and then other people that joined from INSCOM unattended in the SRI office in New York City. A disaster. And it developed into what we now have as an Ingo Swann cult. And Ingo himself agreed that it was a cult, that Ingo could do no wrong. And this is one of the downsides of Ingo's background in Scientology. One size fits all. Well, that doesn't work here. We had a small riot going on because there were very competent remote viewers we had who thought Ingo Swann technique was ridiculous. In fact, he would have signs on the wall that said, "Content be damned, structure is all that matters." If you have a certain thing that goes to this part of the page, you have something else goes to another part of the page. And we said, that's crazy. You get people caved in on the structure and forget about the fact that they're supposed to be psychic at the same time. And I was eventually charged with the responsibility of evaluating his procedure. And it didn't work. Worked well for him, but hardly anybody else.
What alternative do you propose? What have you found to work?
That's a good question. There's no one size fits all. I sit down and I'm working now with 5 people who are really top of the line remote viewers, and each one of them does something different. My job is to, as a monitor, and I learned a great deal positively about being a monitor from Russ Target, who's really good at that job, is to help guide somebody. For example, if you sit there and say, oh, I know what the target is, it's Times Square, New York City. So my job to go back and say, well, what is it that leads you to the conclusion of Times Square? Oh, it's chaotic. Okay, well, there are lots of things that are chaotic that are not that. So try to get people to describe the experience rather than to interpret the experience. And other than that, there's no magic bullet here.
Mm-hmm. So, and this actually coheres with some of the technique that Ingo developed, which was trying to avoid the analysis that your mind wants to perform on the impressions you're getting.
Yeah, he called it analytic overlay, and that part of what he did was right.
Mm-hmm. So I understand that at one point there was a name proposed for your program that you weren't particularly fond of. What was that?
I walked out of the Pentagon with a Colonel Pete McNeilis, who said, hey, we've got a new nickname for your program. And I said, what's that? Quantum Leap. He said, oh, no, does it have to be? What's wrong with Quantum Leap? I said, hey, Pete, that is the Quantum Leap progress is the smallest possible progress above 0. Can we change the name? And that's how Stargate was born, the name Stargate.
Okay. Now, as we said, in 1985, you became head of the program, put off in Target, moved on. And in 1991, it was transferred from SRI to SAIC. What was it like for you running the program? I imagine there were both some satisfactions and some challenges.
Mostly satisfactions, because I had things changed drastically. I had a $10 million contract from the Army Medical Research and Development Command. And the fellow in charge of that was a Major General Garrison Rapman. And over years, we became really good friends. And what he did, which was unique, most all the money that came to the project up to that point was commissioned by various agencies in the intelligence community who would what the technical term is called MIPR, and I don't know what that actually means. They would send the money to someone who would then send the money to us, including Congress would send us money that way. But Gary Ratmond, General Ratmond, took $10 million out of his budget for the medical command. He didn't get the money from anywhere else. He was so committed to trying to understand how this stuff actually works. It was the first time in the history of our program where we had a sizable fraction of what we were to do is to try to figure out how this stuff actually works. So that was really satisfying. And as part of that, we had a scientific oversight committee to protect us, that we're not fooling ourselves, and to protect the clients, we're not cheating on them, and so on. And to be a member of that committee, and we had 2 Nobel laureates on it and other skeptics. And I'll tell you a brief story about that. Their job was to do 3 things. One, to review our protocols before we did anything. And we were damn good at that. So that was pretty easy. The second thing that they were charged with is they had unannounced drop-in privileges, which none of them took advantage of. And they watched over us for 5 years. And that the most important part of it was when we wrote a final report, like in my first year with that in '85, I had 35 different projects to do for that money. And each one had a final report. Each one had an interim report. And if you want to know something, it was a giant pain in the butt for me. It was writing all those reports rather than doing research. But the Scientific Oversight Committee would look at these reports and to assess them on paper as if they were submitted to the journal of their own discipline. There were physics people there and engineering people and all kinds of psychologists and philosophers, what have you. And in fact, we even had a human use committee, which was part of that. They all had to have super clearances. And the Department of Defense regulation for human use review to make sure you're not abusing humans, you have to have a member of the clergy, believe it or not. And we found a Buddhist monk that had, in fact, a secret clearance. Nakasone was his name, which I thought was really fun. One of the other members of the committee was a longtime friend of mine. He and I had then worked together, Mel Schwartz. And Melvin Schwartz worked at Stanford Physics. And eventually he was awarded the Nobel Prize with Leon Lederman for discovering the muon neutrino. Who cares what that is? So I went up to Mel afterwards and said, "Hey, how would you like to be on our scientific oversight committee?" He says, "You know, I think it's all BS. Are you kidding me? You're wasting your time." I said, "Why do you want me?" And I said, "Well, because that Nobel Prize looks good on the masthead. That's why I want you." And I said, "No, Mel, the reason I want you because I think you're an honest scientist. Would you do it?" And he said, "Okay, what if after looking at you for some period of time and I decided still all nonsense, then what?" And I said, "Well, if you can convince the other members of the committee what you're looking at is all nonsense, then I'll quit immediately and I'll come to work for you at Brookhaven National Laboratory and back to doing physics." He said, "Done." I said, "Mel, we're not even close to done. What are you talking about? What if, after watching us for a year and talking to other members of the committee, what if you decide there's something interesting here?" That caught him off guard. And he said, "I will donate for free some fraction of my time to help you figure out how it works." And he did that up until about a year before he passed away.
Wow. So that's a nice segue then to talking about what might have convinced him. So why don't we talk a little bit about the evidence concerning remote viewing? Now, as listeners of the program will know, it's not claimed that this always works, but it sometimes hits and sometimes misses. Can you give us an example of what was a big hit?
Sure. To put a little background for you here, Jimmy, there's something called inferential statistics in almost all of human research. They're always based from medical trials to sociology, what have you. You say, well, you know, sometimes it works. And there's no human endeavor that works correctly right every single time. Even your autonomic nervous system doesn't behave the same every time you measure it. So you have to have some way of dealing with that, and it's called inferential statistics. And there's books on my shelf and disciplines about how we analyze all that data. That will convince no one. because there is no standard of what it takes. One of the stalwarts in our field was a guy named Stanley Krippner. And at the time, he was head of the division of the American Psychological Association called Humanistic Psychology. And he invited me to give an invited talk at one of their conventions on belief versus evidence in physics. And I can tell you briefly about that story because it's relevant to your question. Murray Gell-Mann, very famous physicist, won the Nobel Prize. And one of the few examples where he put together an idea theoretically before the experiment was done. He said, this must be true. Let's look for this experiment. All right. Let's look for this project. It's called the omega minus particle at Brookhaven. And I can't remember the exact numbers here, but it's conceptually not too far off from what I'm saying. They have what is called a bubble chamber, which can track these high energy particles at the accelerator, and you can see the bubbles, and it's in a magnetic field and how they occur. You learn a lot about what the particles are. And they can take a bubble chamber picture once every 6 seconds because they have to recharge the thing and so on. So they ran for a long number, months and months and months together, full time, every 6 seconds, bang, 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 bang. And they saw two events out of all that data, which was in fact evidence of the omega minus particle. Then they ran for another long period of time, something like 3 times as long, and saw no further events. On the basis of that data, he was awarded the Nobel Prize. Now, that kind of data would not make it into the Journal of Parapsychology as evidence of anything. So why? What's the difference? Well, first of all, he's Murray Gell-Mann, not Ed May. He works at Brookhaven National Laboratory, not the Laboratories for Fundamental Research. There is this completely understandable bias toward theory versus experiment versus independent researchers. Even today, independent researchers are ignored to a large measure. I have a colleague who wrote a paper, a brilliant theoretical physicist, and the paper's been looked at by mathematics and not just him and others. It's a brilliant paper that deserves the Nobel Prize. This paper was able to compute the properties of the Higgs boson long before it was invented, and it turned out it was correct. And he had theoretical understandings of dark matter and dark energy. A brilliant paper. He cannot get it published. Why? Because he's an independent researcher working out of his home.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a serious problem for us. Okay, now what constitutes evidence? Jessica Utz, Professor Jessica Utz, is a
statistics professor.
And in 2016, she was elected the top statistician in the country as president of the American Statistical Association. And in her 70-minute address, 7 minutes of which, and it's on my YouTube screen, I don't know if you had a chance to look at it, she fessed up in public of her interest in parapsychology and addresses this issue about statistics. And it turns out, doesn't matter, but I'd like to run something by you for your listeners. Let's suppose you wanted to open up a brand new restaurant wherever you live, right? And gee, that's kind of neat. And so you don't have a lot of money, but you can afford a place that seats 19 people. And it's got the right decor, you got the best chef in the neighborhood, and brilliant wine cellar and all that stuff, right?
And 19 is great. I love prime numbers.
There you go. It's a good prime number. And 19 people come and fill up a big fanfare opening night. 19 people fill up your restaurant, right? And for the next 3 or 4 days after that, 17 of those original 19 people come to your restaurant. What would you say about the quality of your restaurant?
Well, I would say that 17 of the 19 customers must have been pretty pleased with it because they're coming back, and I'm pleased because they're coming back, which is keeping me in business, and I'm also pleased because 17 is another prime number.
Okay, that's it. That's why it all worked, I think. Okay, so hold that thought, Jimmy, for a moment. Over from 1975 to 1995, various elements of the intelligence community tasked us or the people at Fort Meade with over 500 separate intelligence collection tasking to do that, right? And the 504 missions were spread across 19 different federal agencies. That's where the number came from. the usual suspects, CIA, the Army, the Navy, and so on. Of those 19 agencies, 17 of them returned with additional brand new missions. End of story.
So that's an indication that they found the intelligence you developed useful, and they came back as repeat customers.
Yep. And the winner of that is a joint task force, military joint task force based out of Alameda here in California. For their job is drug interdiction. This was after the Cold War. And they came back 172 separate missions. They would say, okay, not quite this way. Stick a pin in the map in U.S. territorial waters. We know by other means, a boat is leaving Hong Kong or Singapore loaded with contraband stuff. Where can we pick it up and board it in U.S. territorial waters 2 weeks in advance? And we were damn good at that job.
You'd have to be if they come back 170 times.
Yeah. So that addresses the issue, and not really well, actually. What back in the statistic region, what is it, and I don't know the answer to this, that convinces people? I have a good friend, his name is Stephen Coslin. He used to be head of the neuropsychology department at Harvard. And I met him there, and then he came to California, and we're still casual friends. We have pre-pandemic, we'd have lunch every once in a while. He doesn't believe this stuff. I said, hey, what would convince you? Same question you just asked. And he said, it'd have to work all the time. And I said, Stephen, that's BS if you don't mind me saying so. You, in your own discipline, is there anything that you do that works every time? I said, well, I guess not. Then why the hell are you applying that to me? And this is a fundamental problem that has been in parapsychology since forever, since the SPR founding, the Society for Psychical Research in London, which was founded in 1882. And they've been struggling with, they exist today. They published a quarterly journal every single quarter. They've not missed one, including through 2 world wars.
So one thing that would convince some people is a particularly vivid demonstration. The statistics may leave some people cold, but which may be why your friend says, well, I would want to see it work all the time because a statistical argument isn't impressive for him.
Sure.
What's an example of something that happened on the program that would be a really big hit that was impressive to people at the time?
Yeah, well, it spawned a big fight with one of the members of our scientific oversight committee, so it's a good point. One of the things that we were tasked using remote viewing in an experimental circumstance of directed energy weapon systems. Could remote viewing detect what a variety of weapon systems? One of those, it turned out, leaving aside all the double-blind protocols and so on, which were in place, was an electron accelerator in the hills near Lawrence Livermore Laboratory in Berkeley, in California here. And the remote viewer just basically nailed it. Described the West Gate at Livermore and described the shape of the building and so on. Just beautiful. I mean, top of the line remote viewing. Okay. One of the critics we had on the Oversight Committee, he was a Bayesian statistician and head of the department at the University of California at Riverside. He beat up on us forever. He doesn't believe in any of this stuff. All the analysis is too complex. There's got to be a mistake there. Chuck Oniton coined the term ESP, meaning error someplace. So he was convinced there's an error in there. And then I showed him the Westgate picture. And he says, I got it. He was convinced based on that brilliant piece of remote viewing. So Jessica Utz was there with me, and we took this poor guy out in the parking lot and read him the riot act. And Jessica's talk to the ASA, American Statistics Association, single evidence, single experience is not evidence of anything. And in her talk, she says, she's asked statisticians and skeptics, okay, what would convince you, more data or a single personal experience? And as humans, she said, most often, a personal experience, just like I described.
Another incident that I've read about that occurred fairly early on involved Joe McMoneagle, and it was another one where the client initially was dismissive of the results, and then there was some powerful confirmation. It involved a Russian submarine. What
Yep.
can you tell us about that story?
Sure. The National Security Council, advisory arm to the president, they had known about a place in northern Russia in Severodvinsk that had been a submarine base ever since World War II. And they also knew, contrary to what is out in the public about it, we have all the data from them, is that they knew that they were building this huge submarine called the Typhoon class, they even had the name of it. And they tasked Joe with, can't exactly remember, I think it might have been a photograph of, no, it was, I know what it was, excuse me. He was tasked with just, I don't remember exactly. It could have been the geographical coordinates of it, most likely. And Joe gave this marvelous description. In fact, in one of our books, ESP Wars East and West, we have a 137-page transcript of his work, which was brilliant, just brilliant. And he describes the construction of a submarine and silent and blah, blah, blah. Basically,
inside of a sealed building that they had satellite imagery of that was distant from the shore.
No, it was not. That's Joe is wrong when he puts it out that way. He won't ever say that again because I said, you can't keep saying that. That's not right. He would say the Russians wouldn't build a submarine, that distance from the shore, and they wouldn't, and they didn't. This building is right smack dab on the water, and we have satellite imagery of it at the time and so on. But nonetheless, Joe described the submarine extremely accurately. And as an aside, we have permission to go, there's one remaining Typhoon class sub surviving as a training machine, and we have permission to go on board with the film crew. So I told my wife, hey, what we want to do is go under the polar ice cap. No, in an old Soviet leaking boat? No way. So yeah, if I have to die, what a great way to go, I don't want to downgrade anything that Joe does. He and I are close friends. We've worked together since the 70s, and we consider each other brothers. And I've been back there doing all the surgeries and blah, 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 blah. But occasionally he gets stuff wrong. He's a human.
Joe has some health problems we should explain that he's had to deal with. Yeah.
Yeah. So there was a brilliant piece of work. There was a guy, head of somebody on the NSC that came out there. I can name him, why not? Captain Jake Stewart. Very smart guy. So they were happy with that. But Joe did more interesting things in terms of, but probably one of the best, you're interested in the best result was by Ingo Swann years back. He was given the geographical coordinates of a site that's about 30 kilometers north of Moscow. And what he did, instead of writing and drawing like they do in a normal remote viewing thing, he expressed his experience in modeling it with clay. And he said, oh, this is a four-sided pyramid that's truncated on top, and it's huge, and he cut it in half, the clay model, and he made it hollow inside. He said, you don't want to be inside whenever it's running. Turned out, he nailed it. It is a over-the-horizon anti-ballistic missile site, still exists there in Moscow. It's about 400 meters on a side, huge. And again, we have permission to get inside of it with the film crew if we ever get to doing a documentary of it.
Cool. Well, let's talk about the other side of the spectrum. In addition to big hits, there have been some big misses. And I understand, I'd like you to tell us about at least one of those that involved the State of the Union address.
Yeah, this was not a formal task. One of our remote viewers handed me an 18-page write-up of an experience he had. This was before the State of the Union address.
This was back during the Reagan administration in the
In
80s.
the Reagan administration, yeah.
And so this was a spontaneous ESP experience that he had. He wasn't assigned to do this.
That's right. In fact, there are two things associated, and I'll discuss both of them with you. If you're going to sort of, in the vernacular, if you're going to ask the genie a question, you better make sure you know what question you're actually asking the genie, because the genie will answer the question you thought you were asking, but didn't. Anyway, so this viewer gave me this page, and I read the whole thing, and it gave a detailed description of what, long before 9/11, of a 9/11 experience. During the State of the Union, a plane was coming down the Potomac River to land at the airport there and crash into the Capitol building and kill everybody. Okay, so I went to Jim Salyer, who was on site with us for 8 years from the Defense Intelligence Agency. He had a master's degree in genetics, was a very smart guy, very irascible at times. And he read it and he said, "Ed, are you handing this to me officially?" I said, "What do you mean by that?" He says, "If this is official, I will take it as the truth." This was a month before the State of the Union. "I will take it as real, and God help you if you're wrong."
Because he'd have to act on it. He'd have to run it through the system. That's
right. And I thought, holy cow. I had the worst 24 hours of my career, literally. So I took the thing back to the office and I read it in detail. And I decided at the end of the day not to hand it in. Turned out, there were, of this 18 pages, there were only two things that were right. All the rest were wrong. And the two things that were right was there would be a foreign head of state on the podium with Reagan during the State of the Union. That had never been done before in history. And it would be female, and she'd be wearing a red hat. Out of 18 pages, those are the only two things that were right. It turns out it was Maggie Thatcher. And in the newspaper in San Francisco, I had a color picture of her wearing a red hat. The rest of it was totally wrong.
So fortunately, you didn't end up running that through the system, which would have caused, when it didn't happen, it would have caused an enormous problem.
Exactly correct. Now, there's a second sort of similar thing, actually with the same remote viewer. This remote viewer was tasked. What's going to happen during the Reagan Christmas tree lighting ceremony on this date? Because they had evidence that there might be an attack. And the remote viewer gave a detailed description of a senior military officer being kidnapped off the streets of Italy. That had nothing to do at all with this tasking. But it was right. That's when General Dozier was snatched off the streets of Italy.
And that the viewers played a significant role in that case as well.
Not really. It's the reason not really. Every psychic in the world was writing to the Italian police, so they flooded the poor police people in Italy. And one of our people from DIA, Dale Graff, was on the ground there trying to help. And they said, Dale would say, "We got this beautiful remote viewing by one of our top guys." And the police said, "No way, go away." What happened is, after the fact, when they found Dozier, it turned out that one remote viewing by this viewer was correct. In fact, we have written up in one of our books the debrief of Dozier on that issue. And he said, the only reason you could know about those details about my captivity being chained to a radiator, blah, blah, all that stuff, is because you had an agent, a turned agent there with me. And if that's so, why was I being held prisoner for so long? And they told him how it happened. He said, we need to train military officers and executives on what to think about their environment so psychics can find you, end quote.
Interesting. Now, in view of the fact that this doesn't always work all the time, and for other factors, not everybody in the government and in Congress and in the military and the intelligence agencies were in favor of this.
Correct. Absolutely.
So what kind of opposition did you encounter when you were heading the program? Was it, for example, difficult to get funding? I mean, $20 million sounds like a lot, but not when it's spread over 20 years.
Yeah, and in terms of other intelligence programs, it's chump change. They wouldn't even cover stamp budget. We had a series of protectors. One of the fellow was deputy director for science and technical intelligence at the Defense Intelligence Agency, Dr. Jack Verona. And he's still with us. He's getting a little long in the tooth. And he stood in the way of the skeptics. The problem is the reverse side of this thing is what Stargate did for the intelligence community was so well liked by people who knew about the data. It was briefed all the way up to 2 separate presidents, vice presidents, agency directors. So there were a lot of skeptics in between, but boy, the bosses said, buzz off. But still, give an example of how frustrating it would be. After the program closed, Joe McMonagle and I spent a decade trying to get it restarted. And at the working level, who are involved in getting the actual data and informing decision makers with it, they loved it. At the boardroom, which was sort of intermediate between that and the top guys who had all retired for the most part, wouldn't have nothing to do with it, so we gave up. Now, one top guy who is then the minority director, what do they call him? In Senate Intelligence Committee, he was the minority Republican in charge, and that was William S. Cohen. And he was a major supporter of what we did and stood in the way of skeptics. When he was in the Intelligence Committee, the way the government works here, they have what are called authorizations for funding money. Authorizing. So the Senate Select Committee for Intelligence authorized $6 million for our program. Authorized doesn't mean appropriated. It means we just need this, and so that goes over to the finance committees, both in the House and the Senate, and they argue out. They say, okay, we got far too much request for money authorization than there is in the budget, right? So somebody has to draw a line, and eventually the $6 million got whittled down to $2 million, and we got the money that way. And then years later, it turned out Cohen became Secretary of Defense under the Clinton administration. And it turned out that Angela Ford knows him really well. And,
Angela Ford was one of the viewers from the Fort Meade program.
That's correct. And so it turns out that we were writing, putting all these books together called the Stargate Archives. And I said to Angela, let's meet Cohen. So we went to his office on K Street. He's now retired from the government. And long story short, I said, hey, would you be willing to write a foreword for this data since you were so instrumental in making sure that it survived? He said, be my pleasure. So we have now a foreword by the former Secretary of Defense saying how good this stuff is.
Okay. In 1995, the program ended up being shut down. And at the time, why did people think that was happening? And has anything else been learned since then about why it was shut down?
Boy, do we. When it turns out the Congress had what's called a Congressionally Directed Activity, CDA. And the Congress directed the CIA to do a 20-year retrospective evaluation of whether this was any good or not. And if they conclude it is good, they would be tasked by Congress to take the program away from the Defense Intelligence Agency and put it in charge of CIA directly. Mm-hmm. All right. CIA then hired the Army AIR, the Army Institute, what's it? AIR, American Institutes of Research. That's an Army organization, and they were hired to do the evaluation. Long story short, they did a hatchet job.
This was a report that was overseen by Jessica Utz, who is a professor of statistics, and also Ray Hyman, who is a professor of psychology and a skeptic.
Yeah, well, even Ray Hyman said there's evidence that he can't explain that the stuff is real. and in Just Guts, they were in agreement to that. But the AIR report basically said the jury is still out whether it was useful or not for intelligence collection. So they wouldn't even let me, the program director at that time, have a copy of it, either the unclassified or the classified version. So I went to Washington and I went into Cohen's office and said I was really pissed off. They didn't give me a copy of the report. He says, "Here, take mine." And he asked me, could I refute it? And I said, well, probably so. I heard from the rumor line what was good, Jessica told me what was in it. And he said, write a report and pull no punches, which I wrote a paper in the Journal of Parapsychology, published it as to what was going on, blah, blah, blah. Turns out everything I said in that paper was wrong, completely off base.
So what did you say? What was your theory at the time?
Well, it was pretty clear that I thought the fix was in. I had given them 10 of my best papers and they never read them. I gave them a list of people, end users that they should go talk to. They didn't interview any of them, all right? They basically didn't do they disobeyed Congress to do this 20-year retrospective. They only looked 1 year back in history. So I thought that was the reason. That it was written by a bunch of skeptics who didn't want this thing to survive. And they were right, it shut it down. However, years later, while we're putting the Stargate archive collection books together, we found from the CIA itself what actually happened. What actually happened is this. After the Cold War, the intelligence communities were still getting a lot of money, which were somehow the Congress was saying, why do you need all this money? We're not doing all this stuff anymore. And the CIA was directed by Congress, and we have the actual CIA memo, not from us, saying, look, if you don't slim down all your satellite little programs, which included us, if you don't shut them down, we're going to close the CIA. They were threatening to close the CIA.
And the CIA had other problems at the time, like the Alder James scandal, where they had a mole that was helping the Soviets that was uncovered.
That's what drove all this stuff, the Alder James story. And so now the guy who did it was happy to get us off, close us down, but he now had a directive by Congress that he had to whittle not only our program, but a whole bunch of other smaller ones, because ours was small,
Mm-hmm.
So that's why it went away.
Okay. Now, after it went away, you mentioned you and Joe tried for a decade to try to restart it in some way. What kind of things were you proposing? I know one involved actually an effort we might have done in conjunction with the Russians now that the Cold War was over.
When the Cold War was over, I had an opportunity to go to Moscow in 1992, just after the government fell there, with one of my dear late colleagues, Larissa Valenskaya. She changed her name and became known as Laura V. Faith. We traveled together probably 6 or 7 times to Moscow during that era. And cute story, the people that we met, in fact, I wrote 2 papers about it, were not military at all. They were, frankly, the Russians would, some of their non-military people, in fact, even some of their military people, would make New Age California look like hard science. They really are off the charts there. But I was giving a talk. I met Kogan, this very famous guy, very sweet man, and he arranged for me to give a talk at Moscow State University. So I was there giving this talk at Moscow State, and Larissa was translating English into Russian. And 2 guys in suits walk in the back door, and I went, uh-oh, 2 guys in suits at the university. This doesn't bode well. And they said to Larissa, come with us. And we did. And we went over to the Ministry of Defense. And they had specially, do you know what a SCIF is? Do your viewers know SCIF? Special Compartmented Information Facility. Only top secret stuff is in them. There's one in Congress, and we had one at SRI, and so on.
And you're not allowed to take it out.
Anything out. So we went into a Russian SCIF, And there in civilian clothes was Alexei Yurovich Savin, who is an admiral and in charge of their psychic program, which is
So this is their equivalent of Stargate.
yes, indeed, under the magical name Group 10,003. And it was a very interesting guy. And he has 2 PhDs, one in philosophy and one in mathematics. Very, very smart man. And he was still in the Ministry of Defense. And he reported in his food chain, the next person above him would be equivalent to the U.S. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They had 120 remote viewers in that period.
Compared to us having like 23.
Yeah, but that'll spread over time. At any given time, yeah, right.
At any given time between 3 and 6 or 7.
Something like that, yeah. So I had talked to him. We met him on a number of occasions. One time we were out there and having far too much vodka, 11 straight shots of vodka. I don't know if you know, a Russian shot is like that. I'm not joking.
Mug-sized.
Almost. And so I don't drink anything, so I was really out cold. The next day we were meeting at this place with the Russian remote viewers and the military and the GRU, which is their intelligence gathering army, the arm of the military. And we're sitting around a table.
The GRU is the successor to the KGB, is that correct?
No, that's FSB. The GRU is equivalent to our military intelligence gathering. Yeah.
Like DIA then.
Yeah, exactly. So we're sitting out there, and Larissa's with me, and Joe McMonagle's with me at that time. And the next day, after drinking all that vodka, I filled my glass full of water. And when you talk to any of the senior Russian military people, and in fact, in general, it's very important. His name is Alexei Yurovich Savin. Instead of calling him General Savin or Admiral Savin, I would call him, the tradition is Alexei Yurovich. That is a formal way of greeting him.
Yeah, and the Yurovich is a patronym, meaning it means son of Yuri.
Exactly correct. Thank you. So I was giving a talk, talking around the table with his staff there. He was still in the military at the time. And I said, Alexei Yurovich, and he interrupted me. And I've known the man now for 22 years, and this is the only time he spoke to me in English. And he said, Ed, call me Alexei. We're friends. And his staff went, then he switched back to Russian. And as we were getting ready to leave, he told Larissa, look, here is my organization chart. We have a problem here, the same that you do, called terrorism. People have attacked us from the southern tier of our country. I want a joint program with the DIA. So he says, you're going to write up what's called a contact report. I said, yes, sir. I've done it all the time. He said, yeah, I know. I expect you to do that. Talk to your people and let's get a joint program going. So I wrote up a 30-page report with the guy's organization chart and pictures and all. So I said, take as many pictures as you want of us. So I've got some really funny pictures of Savin and Joe totally swazzled. I mean, they're out of their mind. They can't even stand up. They've had so much. They're like, oh. I said, I'm going to publish those pictures one day. You'll be sorry. Jimmy, I literally handed that report to the 3-star admiral in charge of the Defense Intelligence Agency in the Pentagon here. This guy, Savin, wants to have a joint program. There are a number of reasons it's worthy. One, it's cheap. A bottle of scotch will get everything you need. Secondly, it does not put anyone in harm's way. And the guy said, yes, Admiral Wilson was his name. He said, it's great. Thank you very much. I'm going to Moscow next week. I'll bring it up. Well, I walked out of the building, out of his office. You could practically hear him throwing it in the wastebasket. Never happened.
So he wasn't interested at all?
None whatsoever.
Okay. These days, you are the head and the founder of the Laboratories for Fundamental Research. Tell us about what kind of work you're doing now, and have you had any interesting findings recently? I mean, we're going to have a separate discussion on that in general, but can you give us maybe a preview?
Sure. I was used to getting the smallest contract that I would even accept while I was on Stargate was $500,000. The organizations SRI and SAIC wouldn't even submit a proposal if it were less than that, because they have all this bureaucracy within the building, and there's literally dozens of people who are involved in writing proposals to the federal government, and so it costs a lot of money to do that. So when the program closed, I was out of money and I was getting unemployment insurance. Literally, I had no job. And it turned out a very well-known parapsychologist at the time and psychologist is a guy named Bob Morris. And he was a psychologist here in the States. And what happened at that time, which is an interesting story for your listeners, a fiction writer from Hungary by the name of Arthur Koestler. And Arthur Koestler bequeathed, when he passed away, a huge sum of money to be given to the psychology department at Edinburgh University for the study of parapsychology.
And they have a big parapsychology program, relatively speaking, at Edinburgh University.
Because of that bequeath. They didn't have any before that. So the psychology department was really nervous that, we don't want to do parapsychology, we'll get killed here, right? So they had a nationwide search to find out who would be the first occupier of that professorship. They call it a chair. And Bob Morris won. So he and his family moved to Edinburgh, and for 17 years, he was in charge of this unit. And he was so successful at it that the university started bragging about it on their website. And not only that, Bob Morris became head of the British psychology department, division at the federal level in Britain. Very famous, well-gone. He spawned about 50 PhDs in parapsychology. Very, very smart guy. However, one of the things that Bob had run into was a group down in Porto, Portugal, called the BIAL Foundation, BIAL Foundation. The BIAL Corporation is Portuguese's largest pharmaceutical manufacturing. And the guy in charge of that was the fourth generation owner, a fellow medical doctor by the name of Luis Portela. Speaks fluent English, was educated in the UK and so on. And he decided that he was interested in ESP and in that sort of thing. And he asked Bob what to do. And Bob said, well, you need to have a private foundation so that you can donate money. So Portela set up a foundation called the BIAL Foundation. And he takes some profits from the pharmaceutical thing, and he funds about every 2 years, he puts €500,000, which is chump change, frankly. I yelled at him, you got to put more money. They fund parapsychology at about 50K euros is the maximum grant you can get for 3 years. That does not fund anybody at the senior level anywhere. And so years later, a decade later, he funded me, actually, saved my butt. And over a decade, I have about $500,000 worth of support for this small little company. Okay, to do real basic research, and I've had 10 proposals, 3 of which were turned down, but 7 were successful. And I can tell you, give you sort of a trailer for it here in a minute. One of the so basically, they've been doing that, and they're still doing it. Okay, now I've retired from there. I was on their science advisory board for a while. And I told them at my last meeting there that I wanted to step aside and let some younger people take over, which is happening, which is good news. Okay, what theory things did we know based from Stargate and then later that we thought of the problem? First of all, we're all materialists. We're not interested in survival after bodily death and consciousness, none of that. We think all through the program, actually, we thought that this will be eventually understood in terms of physics, psychology, physiology, and maybe we'll throw in some spirituality and philosophy in here, but it's all in here in the brain, not external. That consciousness, this whole program thought, including me, that consciousness is an emergent property of the wetware in here. Mm-hmm. Now, a lot of people disagree with that. Fair enough. We have evidence they don't. have strictly personal experiential evidence, which is very powerful. I myself have had those kinds of experiences. Okay, so one of the things that we noticed on the project, Stargate program, that changes of entropy of a target site, people did much, 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 much better than when there was no change of entropy. In terms of operational work, if you wanted to find some cocaine, it was hard to find. But if you wanted to find some radioactive material, it was easy to find. If you were tasked in all the right blinding conditions and so on, if you were tasked on an underground nuclear explosion, we would nail that sucker. So
because radiation involves the amplification of entropy.
Yeah, change of entropy.
So making it easier to find.
Right. So that's the hypothesis.
Okay.
So the BL people funded me to explore that. And we found it. Not only that, just here's the trailer. I don't know if you know this about the normal sensory systems, the 5 that we're familiar with. Actually, it turns out there's a lot more recently, but let's talk about the big 5. All of them are change sensitive. In other words, if you could focus on a spot on the wall and you're staring at it, your eyes are moving back and forth, and you can't stop it. If you were able to stop your eyes from micro wiggling, your experience would be a blank slate black. The way to think of that is in electrical engineering, there's a term called AC, alternating current and direct current, all right? All of our sensory systems are set to be alternating current sensitive. That capacitors in there, to use a technical term. And that's true for your ears, your nose. Somebody walks in with too much cologne on or perfume, you smell it immediately, oh my God, yeah. And then you get used to it. And the technical term is habituate. And so with that, okay, if the S in extrasensory perception is a sensory system, which we didn't know, then there must be something that ESP is better when that thing is changing compared to when that thing is not changing. And we found it, thanks to the BL people.
Okay.
It's the change of entropy.
Okay. Well, I look forward to discussing that with you in our next conversation. Is there anything, before we close this one, is there anything else you'd like to tell us or anything you'd like to plug? And we'll have a link to your page on Amazon so people can get your books.
Okay. The only book that I'd recommend people getting is ESP Wars. It's a fun read and so on. There's a section of if you're more interested in the technical stuff. Unfortunately, it's expensive, $100, but it gives a technical overview of these 2 books called Extrasensory Perception, Support Skepticism and Science. One has the history and one is all theory of psi functioning. But you got to be pretty geeky to enjoy that. If you're having trouble sleeping, this is a good book to buy.
But then ESP Wars is about the Russian-American interaction.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's funny in places. In fact, quite amusing in places. So I think that's basically from looking through this. Oh, you asked me about William Proxmire and the Golden Fleece Award.
Yes. So for people who may not remember, William Proxmire was a Democratic senator from Wisconsin, and he was a critic of excessive or wasteful government spending. And every year he would have an award he would give called the Golden Fleece,
Right.
pun off of Jason and the Argonauts' search for the Golden Fleece, and then fleecing the public of their money.
Exactly.
So tell us about his involvement.
Well, it turns out we're all terrified that we'd be in his crosshairs. Turns out that was wrong. He loved our work. We have letter exchanges we've published that he was in great support of what we did. We were not ever in threat of getting the Golden Fleece Award.
Well, that's great. So he actually ended up being a friend of the program rather than one of the people targeting it.
You bet.
Okay. Well, Dr. May, thank you very much for being with us today, and I look forward to our next discussion.
I would too also, Jimmy.
Jimmy, that was great. So one of the things Dr. May did in the interview was express skepticism regarding the training methodology that Ingo Swann developed.
Correct. That method is known as CRV. Originally, it stood for Coordinate Remote Viewing, but today it stands for Controlled Remote Viewing. CRV breaks up the viewing process into a series of stages that provide a controlled structure for the experience, which is why it's called Controlled Remote Viewing.
Dr. May said this worked well for Ingo, but not for a lot of other people. This claim will be controversial with Ingo's supporters.
It will, but in this series, I'm letting everyone speak from their own experience and express their own views. I mean, these are, after all, interviews rather than debates. So I'm here to listen, not to advocate for any particular position.
One of Dr. May's criticisms was that Ingo would give trainees feedback in the middle of a session, so that if a person said the target contained a particular element, like water, Ingo would confirm this. So you could sort of play 20 questions and figure out what the target was. Do you have an idea of how supporters of Ingo's method would respond?
Ultimately, they need to speak for themselves, and we'll raise that issue with users of Ingo's method in a future episode and see what they have to say. For the moment, my impression is that they would say that giving that type of feedback is something that generally should only be done during training, when a viewer is first learning the CRV session, but then he needs to be weaned off of it so that he doesn't have that kind of confirmation in an operational remote viewing session. Whether students are effectively able to transition away from that and what the long-term success rate is for Ingo's method in operational situations is a different question, and one that we can look at more closely in the future.
You indicated that we're going to have a future discussion with Dr. May. What can you tell us about that?
At the time we recorded the discussion we've just heard, we also did a two-part interview on the parapsychological research that Dr. May has been conducting and what his findings have been. As you heard, one of his findings concerns entropy. Entropy is the tendency of a system to go from a state of order to disorder, for energy to dissipate and for the system to run down. It's why stars shine and why you need to eat to replenish your body's fuel supply. What he discovered is that remote viewers seem to have an easier time if there are changes in the entropy level at a particular target. So we'll be discussing that, but there is a lot more to what we talked about, and it's really fascinating. Dr. May has some very unique views that contrast with those of many other parapsychologists, and so we go into these in some detail. So be sure and check out our next pair of interviews with Dr. May coming up in future.
So, Jimmy, what further resources do you have for the listener and viewer on Dr. May?
Well, for those who are listening to an audio version of the podcast, we'll have a link to the video version on my YouTube channel. And like I said, please subscribe and hit the bell while you're there. We'll also have a link to Ed's book, ESP Wars, East and West, that describes the conflict over remote viewing and psychic functioning between the former Soviet Union and the United States. Also, his author page on Amazon, his website, Laboratories for Fundamental Research. We'll have links to SRI and SAIC, the two government contractors that hosted the program. Also, information on Ingo Swann, operant conditioning, Robert Monroe, the Monroe Institute, Joseph McMoneagle, information on the kidnapping of Major General James Dozier, and the Soviet military unit 10003, the Soviet equivalent of Stargate.
Excellent. So we have mysterious feedback this time on our recent episode on the Exodus. And our first feedback comes from Joshua, who commented on YouTube, who said, "Excellent show. I particularly like the breakdown of the 10 plagues and its relationship to the Egyptian flooding and agricultural cycle. That's not one I've heard before, and something that is especially intriguing to me. I do believe the Exodus happened. One piece of evidence that I was surprised you did not mention is Moses' name itself. I find it likely that Moses is the second part of an Egyptian theophoric name such as Tutmos, Amos, or Ramesses. These mean child of Thoth, child of the moon, and child of Ra, respectively, which is an obvious dilemma if Yahweh is the one true God, so the Egyptian deity's name was dropped by the author so as not to offend God by acknowledging other gods."
Yeah, theophoric names were very common in the ancient Near East. A theophoric name is one that bears the name of a god within it. And you see lots of these in the Bible, like Daniel. Don-E-L means, Don means judge, and the E suffix means my, and El means God. So Daniel means God is my judge. And since it has the name El in it, it's a theophoric name because Daniel bears the name of a God within it. So all of those Hebrew names that you see that like have Yah or Iyah in them, that's shortened for Yahweh. So those are also theophoric names. And they were very common in Egypt as well. In addition to the translations that Joshua gives, the names like Tutmos and Amos and Ramesses, they've got that Mos element in there, Meses or Moses element. We don't really know about the vowels in Egyptian because it wasn't written with them. So Egyptologists, when we're unclear about a vowel, will frequently just shove in E as a placeholder. So if we know MSS was part of one of their names, it'll be Meses, like in Ramesses. And that means, it can mean child. It also means things like born. And so you'll sometimes hear Ramesses be translated as like Ra is born, or born of Ra, or child of Ra in this case. And it is quite possible that Moses was originally a theophoric name that has been circumcised to remove the theological part of the name. And so that is quite possible. And if I had to guess if Moses was a theophoric name that he was given by the Egyptian princess, it could well have been Ramesses. Ra is born, based on, as we'll hear in an upcoming episode where we talk about the timing of the Exodus, not just that it occurred, but when it occurred. And so he could have been named after Ra, or it could have been one of the other Egyptian gods, and then they could have dropped that after he became a worshiper of the Hebrew god Yahweh. So that's entirely possible. On the other hand, we do seem to have some records of Moses or Meses being used as an Egyptian name non-theophorically, so that it did not have a divine element in the name. And because of, we do have instances of that in the historical record, I couldn't be confident that Moses is a theophoric name. I think it's quite possible, maybe even likely, but I couldn't prove it, and so that's why I didn't go into it, given that I was also trying to keep the episode of reasonable length.
Colleen sent an email. She wrote, I have a question regarding the criterion of embarrassment. In the show, Jimmy stated that slavery would have been an embarrassing origin story for the Israelites, and therefore they would not have stated that were it not true. However, it is also stated that it was told to Abraham by God that the Israelites were set apart and chosen by him, and that they would one day enter the promised land after being slaves. Would the fact that they had been promised a new land and then were delivered from slavery through direct divine intervention not diminish or negate a criterion of embarrassment? It seems as though divine deliverance from oppression and being a chosen people might actually be points of pride for the Israelites. Could you elaborate some for me?
I recognize that the chosenness of Israel would give them a sense of national pride, and so yes, it could take some of the edge off of having previously been a bunch of slaves of a local superpower, but it wouldn't have removed it entirely. Because if they're living in the land and they simply say to themselves, okay, we're the chosen people of God, we conquered this land from the Canaanites, and we're, God has blessed us. Why go into and we used to be slaves? Why bring that up if it's not true? Because even if the other elements are things they're taking pride in, we used to be slaves is not something they would take pride in, because that's a downer. And as a result, and I should mention, in ancient Near Eastern societies, including ancient Israel, they thought very corporately. I mean, that's like why at Passover it's, what is the significance of this night? It's because God took us out of Egypt, and they talk as if they were there for it. So they have a lot of solidarity in ancient Israel with the prior generations, including the generations that were in slavery in Egypt. And so if they were just making up a national origin story and wanted to aggrandize themselves like you see in many national origin stories, they wouldn't have bothered to include that downer element.
Chad writes on Facebook, terrific show as always. I saw the movie on which this book, Patterns of Evidence Exodus by Timothy Mahoney, was based maybe 6 or 7 years ago. Have you seen this hypothesis, Jimmy? That Joseph reigned in Egypt during the Middle Kingdom? They critique most contemporary dating of the Egyptian calendar. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
So I am familiar with the Patterns of Evidence series. It's produced by some evangelicals, and I think they're really sweet, well-meaning guys who are totally wrong on their historical claims. They make claims that are not supported by Egyptology or biblical studies in order to promote a particular view of things. And I don't fault them for having a view, and I don't fault them for challenging, received wisdom. It's always good to challenge things and see if they stand up. But I'm afraid this time the standard historical accounts do stand up, and they're misusing evidence. A number of years ago, I went and saw one of the Patterns of Evidence movies, not the one about Joseph reigning during the Middle Kingdom. Joseph is more properly dated to the second intermediate period between the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom. And there are a variety of ways that we can know that, which we'll talk about in a future episode on the dating of the Exodus. But the chronology that the Patterns of Evidence folks promote is not reliable, and I critiqued their movie on Moses, and so we'll have a link to that one, and we'll also have another link to give you some feedback on Patterns of Evidence, which we'll learn about in our next piece of feedback.
Yes, Dr. David Falk wrote on YouTube, this is a really great primer on the Exodus. The content is really sound and fact-based.
Thank you. I really appreciate that, Dr. Falk. For those who may not be familiar with him, he is an Egyptologist, and he has a PhD on Egyptology from the University of Liverpool. So he is well qualified in this field, and to have him complementing my coverage of the Exodus, the evidence that an Exodus-like event did happen, and have his endorsement is very gratifying. So thank you, Dr. Falk. I should note he also has a YouTube channel called Ancient Egypt and the Bible, which he set up because there's a lot of misinformation out there on YouTube about ancient Egypt and the Bible, including the Patterns of Evidence stuff. So we'll have a link to his channel. Be sure and check it out, and especially if you're interested in why is the Patterns of Evidence stuff problematic, Dr. Fox got you covered. He's got some playlists on his channel that are well worth watching.
Robert writes on Facebook, if the Merneptah Stele records a victory over Israelites wandering in the Sinai before settling in Canaan, why doesn't the Pentateuch mention fighting with the Egyptians in the account of the wandering in the wilderness?
Basically because the Pentateuch is not a complete record of everything that happened. It preserves historical traditions that go back to the period of the Exodus, but it doesn't record every single thing that happened. I mean, some of those traditions may have been lost by the time that Genesis was written. Others may have been deemed by the author not to be significant enough, or might have been contrary to the storyline he was presenting. I mean, if the key plot point in your tale is our ancestors got out of Egypt, you may not want to mention, oh yeah, and a few years later the Egyptians arrived here and kicked our butts. So, which is what the Merneptah Stela says, is that Merneptah basically kicked the Israelites' butts in some battle occurring outside of Egypt, apparently during the period before they were settled in the land. And so I could see why that would be left out. Interestingly, and if you look at James K. Hoffmeyer's stuff on the Exodus, he points out, and others have pointed out, that actually place names that we see in like the book of Judges and some of the other early books in the Hebrew Bible actually preserve traces of occasions when an Egyptian pharaoh did do one of their Goa'uld like periodical smash and grab raids. And so you'll find places like, oh, this place name is derived from Pharaoh's Spring because it's a spring that was at the site of a battle involving Pharaoh. And so they did have this, continue to have this interaction in the pre-dynastic period of Israel, before Israel had a king.
Michael writes on Facebook, love this episode. Listen to it twice over the weekend. Thanks for clearing up the chariot wheels and the Red Sea claims. I was wondering why people didn't make a big deal about it. Now I know it was a hoax.
It was, yeah. The any claims you see about chariot wheels from the Exodus having been found in the Red Sea are bogus. We don't know where the crossing site was. The relevant bodies of, not with precision, the relevant bodies of water have not had extensive archaeological surveys done of them, and the Egyptians were using wooden chariot wheels, so they would have rotted over the last 3,000 years or 3,200, 3,300 years and wouldn't be identifiable today anyway.
Trish writes on Facebook, do you think it's possible Akhenaten was the son of the pharaoh at the time of the Exodus? I wonder this because he did have an older brother that died, and something big must have happened in his lifetime to make him turn to monotheism.
I don't think so. And partly this is what we'll cover in a future episode on the timing of the Exodus. Akhenaten was a pharaoh in the 18th dynasty, and he lived about 100 years too early for the Exodus. And so I know it can be tempting for people to want to say, ooh, maybe Moses inspired Akhenaten towards monotheism, but that doesn't seem to be the evidence. If anything, I mean, if you want to know more about the ancient Israelite conception of God and how God relates to the pagan deities, go back and listen to our episode on God and the gods, because it's more complex than you might think just from the term monotheism. But in Akhenaten's case, if like he had been in the same generation as Moses and like got converted to monotheism, maybe as a result of watching the Exodus happen, then why would he end up worshiping the sun? Because Yahweh is not a solar deity. And also, it doesn't fit with the progression of what we see in the Egyptian monuments. The Egyptian monuments show Akhenaten gradually progressing towards full-blown monotheism, to where he's eventually denying the existence of all other deities besides the Aten, which was the solar disk. But that's a gradual progression, not something that would be the product of a crisis conversion experience, like watching the Israelite God deliver this tribe from Egyptian captivity. And then also, he's living 100 years too early.
Billy D. wrote on YouTube, this was a great episode, Jimmy. My only disagreement is that I think an early date, specifically 1446, is correct. I used to agree with the late date, and I don't have an issue with it per se, but ultimately, I think that most of the pieces of evidence to support it, the Merneptah Stele, Kenyon's dating of Jericho pottery, etc., are pretty circumstantial and can be plausibly interpreted the other way, too.
Well, I appreciate that, and as always, Billy D., I welcome alternative perspectives here on Mysterious World. I very much do not expect everybody to agree with me, so always welcome. I always welcome other viewpoints. And in this case, I would mention that actually I used to support the early date for the Exodus, but then became convinced that the later date is actually what the evidence points to. So you and I have kind of had opposite journeys in that respect. But we'll be talking about that and the reasons for that, or the reasons for my own views, in the future episode on the dating of the Exodus. And in the meantime, check out Dr. David Falk's YouTube channel, where he presents evidence regarding it as well.
Victor writes on YouTube, if I recall, Ramesses III's reign went well at first, but towards the end of his reign, it was somewhat ruined by plagues and a workers' revolt. Could Ramesses III have been the pharaoh who argued with Moses?
It is true that Ramses III's reign did start going badly towards the end, and after Ramesses III's time, the other Ramesside pharaohs just continued to slide because Egypt was heading out of the New Kingdom period, and things were falling apart. We actually talked in episode 89 about Ramesses III, and his reign did not end so well for him, because if you remember, that's the black magic harem conspiracy episode where he was killed by a conspiracy among his secondary wives who enlisted court officials to kill him, including using black magic against him. So if you haven't heard the Black Magic Harem Conspiracy episode, go back and listen to episode 89. The difficulty is that we have evidence for Israel outside of Egypt prior to Ramesses III because the Merneptah stela. Merneptah is the son of Ramesses II, and we have him saying, "Woohoo! I kicked those Israelite butts," while he was on his foreign voyages outside of Egypt, and so we know Israel was already outside of Egypt in the time of Merneptah, and thus before the time of Ramesses III.
The Sage of Rakaseka on YouTube writes, the problem with a providential arrangement hypothesis is that it renders something clearly amazing as something ordinary. So the distinction between nature and supernature isn't the issue. The distinction between ordinary and remarkable, and therefore clearly memorable. It's valid to have an objection there, and that needs to be adequately answered.
Well, I appreciate the concept that the Sage of Rakaseka is explaining here, but I think that actually the hypothesis that has been proposed by various scholars that to refresh people's memory, 9 of the 10 plagues of Exodus are eerily similar to things that actually occur in Egypt on a fairly regular basis as part of its agricultural cycle. They seem like exaggerated versions of things that normally happen. And so you can imagine a particular year where, either due to God or due to random chance, you have a particularly intense series of these events, more intense than what normally happens. And that notability then could have been used to argue that, okay, this is the hand of the Israelite God who is performing these wonders. These are notable events, and he's performing these wonders to tell you, let this people go. And for a pharaoh who believes in the existence of gods that are controlling nature, if a bunch of abnormally strong natural events start happening, when you've got a prophet there interpreting them for you this way, you could be convinced. I mean, imagine a thought experiment. I'm even a little tempted to write a play about this. But suppose it's the early 20th century and you're in Kansas, and it's during the Depression, so things are going badly in society, and you're the mayor of a little town in Kansas, and you've had arrested a particular family, even though the evidence against them is kind of sketchy. But you've still got them in jail, except for this one guy, this one member of this family who is widely regarded as kind of a religious nut job. And then the religious nut job comes to you and says, God has told me that my family is being wrongly imprisoned, and if you don't release them, he's going to smite the town. And then, because it's the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl happens. And all of a sudden, you're having this unprecedented dust storm. that's occurring. Well, you might look at this unusual dust storm that you're not used to having and say, "Oh, maybe brother so and so actually has heard from God." And then brother, but you're not convinced. And then brother so and so comes back to you and says, "See, I told you that dust storm was from God, and if you don't let my family go, there's going to be an even worse thing happen to the town." And so shortly thereafter, there's a massive thunderstorm that destroys the crops that the dust storm didn't deal with. And you're still thinking as mayor, maybe he's right, but he comes back and says, "Yeah, that was another sign from God. And if you don't let my family go, there's going to be something even worse that God is going to send." And a couple weeks after that, there's a tornado that rips up downtown Nowheresville, and most of the town is destroyed. Well, after that, you might think, let's let his family go. Maybe God is actually doing this. So if you have a series of events that could occur in Kansas but are occurring in an abnormally strong way, in a way that is also being interpreted by the local prophet, you might conclude, yeah, this is all a message from God. So I don't think we should dismiss this. I think Pharaoh or his court officials easily could, if they were confronted with a scenario like that, could have said, maybe the Israelite God is doing something here. We should let these people out of here. It's not worth the hassle.
Deborah on Facebook wrote, "I'm curious if Jimmy has looked into and has an opinion on the suggested cause of death of the firstborn Egyptians made in the Exodus Decoded, Simcha Yacobovici documentary. If I recall, the suggestion was that there was an oxygen-robbing gas which only affected the firstborn because they were given a prime sleeping location near the ground where the deadly gas could kill them. It seems the documentary suggests that it was like gases released by a lake lower in the continent of Africa, or from the explosion of a volcanic island, the documentary reports, as being part of the cause of the plagues. Anyway, just curious."
Well, I have heard that and similar theories, naturalistic theories, to try to explain the death of the firstborn. I've also heard ones involving nutrition and things like that. And I'm open in principle to seeing evidence for these, but I haven't seen evidence for them, and I'm natively skeptical of them. You'll notice I mentioned earlier 9 of the 10 plagues of Exodus are similar to what happens in the Egyptian agricultural cycle. The one that is not similar is the death of the firstborn. And so if you believe that the death of the firstborn happened, it would lend itself to a supernatural interpretation rather than a providential timing interpretation. And so, I want to be open to everything and consider evidence for any proposal anybody cares to make, but I have not seen good evidence for any naturalistic explanation of the death of the firstborn. And as a result, I'm skeptical of such explanations. In this case in particular, if someone can show me that we have evidence that firstborn sons slept lower to the ground than the rest of the family, that would help this interpretation. At least that would be supporting one of its premises, but I don't know that to be the case. And my understanding of ancient Near Eastern sleeping habits is that they tended to sleep on mats on the ground, not in an elevated way. And unless you're up on the roof, sleeping on your roof, but even then you're sleeping on a mat that's on the floor of your roof. And so I just have not seen evidence for this. But, I'm open in principle.
Scott sent an email. He said, "I enjoyed the episode on the historicity of the Exodus. I live in Alaska, and I have always thought it was interesting that various native cultures, Yupik, Haida, Tlingit, Inupiaq, etc., traditionally all had stories about a raven who either played a role in creation or who was a sort of very early cultural hero. This covers a wide swath of sparsely populated territory from Siberia through basically all of Alaska and much of coastal British Columbia. The accounts differ in their details, but the similarities are too much for me to say it's just a coincidence. I'm not an expert, but I imagine that for these related traditions to have been so widespread, that they likely reflect an extremely ancient kernel. This makes me think it is not so far-fetched to believe that a pre-literate culture could preserve at least the broad outlines of the Exodus story for several hundred years.
And as we pointed out in our previous episode on the Exodus, and as we'll continue to discuss in our future episode of the Exodus, they didn't have to preserve this memory for that long before it got written down. I mean, even if you buy the early date for the Exodus, no more than 400 years, and really what we're going to see is that it was for no more than 200 years. And you can easily have traditions, especially relating to an event like how you got here in this land, that can be preserved for 200 years easy. And we've also mentioned, like we did in our recent episodes on the Great Flood, there can be traditions that are passed down for thousands of years, like some of the astronomical ones relating to Ursa Major and the Pleiades. Now, I didn't conclude that there was a global flood. I concluded that there was not. But traditions can be passed down for much longer than the 200 years it was necessary for this tradition to be passed down.
So that's all the feedback we have, and thank you everyone for sending in your feedback. We really greatly appreciate hearing from you. Jimmy, what do we have for mysterious headlines this week?
Well, this time we dealt with parapsychology and classified programs, so I thought we'd hit each one of those in our mysterious headlines. First, parapsychology. There is a skeptic named Chris French who historically has, for many years, has disbelieved in parapsychological phenomena and referred to parapsychology as a pseudoscience, which is a common position among skeptics. But really, parapsychologists actually hold themselves usually to higher standards in study design and proof than people in other fields. That's something we definitely talk about in my upcoming discussions with Dr. May. Well, Chris French, even though he still doesn't believe in psychic functioning, has had the intellectual integrity to sit back and look at discussions of, well, what would count, what would make something a pseudoscience, and then compare it to what parapsychologists actually do. And he concluded they don't fit pseudoscience. They're not doing what people say pseudoscience is. They're actually doing science. And so he wrote this article on titled Why I Now Believe Parapsychology is a Science, Not a Pseudoscience. And it's on skeptic.org.uk, so it's on a skeptical website. And he himself, like I said, still doesn't believe in psychic functioning, but he does believe that this is a real area of science. So I thought that itself, his conversion on that point to recognizing the value of the methods that are being used is itself an achievement. So check that out. Then on the classified side of things, lots of people wonder about Area 51 and what's going on there. Well, for a number of years, I've been aware of a former employee of Area 51, not Bob Lazar, although he was a former employee. I don't believe his story. But I have been aware of a former employee named T.D. Barnes, who was involved in the development of radar systems and how to manipulate and use radar out at Area 51. And he recently gave an interview, so we'll have a link to where you can read about that interview and watch the video of it. And in it, he discusses whether or not he thinks the recent ATIP UAP sightings are aliens or terrestrial or what they might be based on his experience actually working at Area 51.
Excellent. Cool. I'll have to check that out. So that'll do it for us. We want to hear from you, your feedback on what your theories are about remote viewing and what Dr. May discussed today. You can let us know by visiting sqpn.com or the Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World Facebook page, or sending an email to mysterious@sqpn.com, or send a tweet to @MYS_world. So, Jimmy, what are we going to talk about next time?
Next week is a Fifth Friday, so we'll be doing Fifth Friday weird questions and be considering topics like superhero guardian angels, the Ark of the Covenant, whether Judas is in hell, whether there are pizza rolls in heaven, how Neanderthals relate to creation, and more weird questions.
Oh, I'm sure my son would love for there to be pizza rolls in heaven, so I can't wait for that. Folks, be sure to join the StarQuest fan club by texting StarQuest to 66866. That's StarQuest to 66866. You can find Jimmy's resources from our discussion and links to the mysterious headlines on our show notes at sqpn.com/mysterious. And remember, to help us continue to produce the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. Until next time, Jimmy Akin, thank you for exploring with us our mysterious world.
Thanks, Dom.
And once again, I'm Dom Bettinelli. Thank you for listening to Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World on StarQuest.